March 14th, 1986, 9:03 a.m. The Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia, room 4C-212, a windowless briefing chamber 3 floors below the main concourse. An admiral named Richard Calloway sat at the head of a polished oak table surrounded by 6 of the most senior intelligence officers in the United States Navy. In front of each of them sat a classified folder stamped with red ink. None of them had opened it yet. Their eyes were fixed on the man standing at the far end of the room, a gaunt figure in civilian clothes, flanked by 2 CIA escorts, his hands trembling as he placed a magnetic tape reel onto the playback unit. His name was Sergey Volkov, 31 years old, former sonar operator aboard the Soviet nuclear submarine K-324. He had defected 11 days earlier through a chain of contacts in Stockholm, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back, a set of forged Swedish travel documents, and this single reel of magnetic tape. The room was silent except for the low hum of the ventilation system. "Play it," Admiral Calloway said. Volkov pressed the button. For 3 seconds there was nothing, just the hiss of blank tape. Then a sound filled the room. Low, rhythmic, unmistakable. Every officer at that table recognized it within 2 seconds. It was the acoustic signature of a ballistic missile submarine, but not just any submarine. Calloway leaned forward. His face, already pale under the fluorescent lights, went white. "That's an Ohio class," he whispered. Volkov nodded slowly. "Yes, Admiral. Recorded at a depth of 340 meters, bearing 047 in the Norwegian Sea. November 9th, 1985. Your submarine was tracked for 11 hours. We knew her course, her speed, her dive pattern. We knew everything." The silence that followed lasted exactly 9 seconds. Then Calloway said 2 words that would trigger one of the most classified investigations in Cold War naval history. "That's impossible." But it wasn't impossible. And the story of how a Soviet sonar operator came to possess the one recording that could shatter the foundation of American nuclear deterrence, that story begins not in a submarine, not in a Pentagon briefing room, but in a freezing apartment in the industrial city of Severodvinsk on the shores of the White Sea, almost 5 years earlier. If this story grips you the way it gripped those admirals that morning, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You're going to want to hear how this ends. Trust me, it gets much worse before it gets better. Sergey Mikhailovich Volkov was born in 1954 in Severodvinsk, a city that most maps of the Soviet Union didn't even show. That wasn't because it was small. Severodvinsk was home to the Sevmash shipyard, the largest submarine construction facility in the world, a sprawling complex of dry docks and assembly halls where the Soviet Union built the machines it believed would win a war that never came. Growing up in Severodvinsk meant growing up surrounded by submarines. Sergey's father, Mikhail, worked as a welder at Sevmash for 26 years. His hands were scarred from 1,000 arc burns, and he walked with a slight limp from a scaffolding accident in 1967 that the shipyard never officially reported. Mikhail Volkov didn't talk about his work. Nobody in Severodvinsk talked about their work. The city itself was classified. A closed city, what the Soviets called a ZATO, an acronym that translated to Closed Administrative Territorial Formation. You couldn't enter without a special permit. You couldn't leave without authorization. The population of roughly 200,000 people lived their entire lives within a perimeter that was, in every practical sense, a military installation disguised as a city. Sergey was the middle child of 3. His older brother Pavel had followed their father into the shipyard. His younger sister Irina studied nursing at the Regional Medical Institute. Sergey was different from both of them. He was quiet, intense, and possessed an unusual gift. He could hear things that other people couldn't. Not in any supernatural sense. Sergey Volkov simply had extraordinary auditory perception. As a child, he could identify the make of a car engine from 2 blocks away. He could tell the difference between his mother's footsteps and his aunt's on the stairs. When the family radio crackled with interference, he could separate the layers of sound and identify what was causing each one. When Sergey was 17, a naval recruiter visited his school. The Soviet Navy was looking for young men with technical aptitude, and Sergey's physics teacher had recommended him. The recruiter administered a series of tests: mathematics, spatial reasoning, mechanical comprehension. But it was the auditory test that changed Sergey's life. They sat him in a room with headphones and played him a series of recordings: underwater sounds captured by hydrophones, engine noise, propeller cavitation, biological sounds from marine life, the creaking of ice sheets. Sergey was asked to identify and separate each layer of sound. He scored higher than anyone the recruiter had tested in 14 years. Within 6 months, Sergey Volkov was enrolled at the Popov Higher Naval School of Radio Electronics in Petrodvorets, just outside Leningrad. He would train for 3 years to become a sonar operator, one of the most critical positions aboard a submarine. In the underwater world of Cold War cat and mouse, sonar operators were the eyes and ears of the fleet. A good sonar operator could detect an enemy submarine before it detected you. An exceptional one could identify the specific vessel, its class, its operational status, sometimes even individual mechanical faults in its machinery. Sergey Volkov would become exceptional. But to understand why his tape recording would terrify the Pentagon, you first need to understand what the Ohio-class submarine actually was, and why the United States considered it invincible. The Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine was the crown jewel of American nuclear deterrence. The first of the class, USS Ohio, was commissioned in 1981 after more than a decade of development and construction at the Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics in Groton, Connecticut. At 560 feet long and displacing nearly 19,000 tons submerged, it was one of the largest submarines ever built. But size wasn't what made it special. Each Ohio-class submarine carried 24 Trident ballistic missiles. Each Trident missile could carry up to 8 independently targetable nuclear warheads. That meant a single Ohio-class submarine, cruising silently beneath the ocean, carried enough nuclear firepower to destroy 192 separate targets. One submarine. That was more destructive power than every bomb dropped in World War II combined, including both atomic weapons used against Japan. The strategic logic was simple and terrifying. Even if the Soviet Union launched a surprise first strike against the United States and destroyed every land-based missile silo, every bomber base, every command center, even if they somehow wiped out the entire visible American military in a single coordinated attack, the Ohio-class submarines would survive. They would be out there, somewhere in the deep ocean, undetectable, untouchable, waiting. And then they would retaliate. This was the concept of second strike capability, the foundation upon which the entire theory of nuclear deterrence rested. The logic was that no rational adversary would ever launch a first strike if they knew that an unstoppable retaliation was guaranteed. And the Ohio class was the guarantee. But the guarantee only worked if the submarines couldn't be found. And that was the Ohio class's most remarkable feature: its silence. The United States Navy had invested billions of dollars and decades of engineering expertise into making the Ohio class the quietest submarine in the world. Every component was designed to minimize noise. The reactor used natural circulation cooling at low speeds, eliminating the need for noisy primary coolant pumps. The propeller was a carefully guarded secret, its exact design classified at the highest level, engineered to produce minimal cavitation. The tiny bubbles created when a propeller spins fast enough to create low-pressure zones in the water, which collapse with a distinctive popping sound that sonar can detect. The hull was coated with anechoic tiles, rubber-like panels designed to absorb sonar pings rather than reflect them back. Internal machinery was mounted on shock absorbers and acoustic isolation systems that prevented mechanical vibrations from transmitting through the hull into the surrounding water. Even the air conditioning system was redesigned to reduce noise. The result was a submarine that, at operational patrol speed, was quieter than the ambient noise of the ocean itself. The Ohio class didn't just hide in the ocean. It disappeared into it. American naval intelligence was confident, and intelligence assessments from the early 1980s consistently reflected this confidence, that Soviet sonar technology was at least a generation behind. The prevailing assessment was that Soviet submarines were loud, their sonar systems crude, and their ability to detect an Ohio-class submarine in open ocean essentially zero. That assessment was about to be proven catastrophically wrong, and the man who would prove it was, at that very moment, sitting in a cramped sonar compartment aboard a Soviet Victor III class submarine, listening to the ocean with a pair of headphones that cost less than an American admiral's dress shoes. Sergey Volkov graduated from the Popov School in 1975, ranked second in his class. His first posting was aboard a Project 671 submarine, known to NATO as the Victor class, operating out of the Northern Fleet Base at Gadzhievo on the Kola Peninsula. Life aboard a Soviet submarine in the 1970s was, by any standard, brutal. The boats were cramped, noisy, and poorly maintained. The food was monotonous. The air recycling systems were unreliable, and it was not uncommon for carbon dioxide levels to rise high enough to cause headaches and dizziness during extended patrols. Fresh water was strictly rationed. Privacy was non-existent. But Sergei didn't complain. He had found his purpose. Sitting in the sonar compartment with his headphones on, the chaos of the submarine faded away, and the ocean opened up to him like a vast three-dimensional landscape of sound. He could hear the clicking of shrimp colonies on the seabed. He could hear the deep, mournful songs of blue whales hundreds of miles away. He could hear the slow grinding of Arctic ice. And he could hear submarines. Within his first year aboard, Sergei developed a reputation. Other sonar operators might detect a contact and classify it broadly: merchant vessel, warship, submarine. Sergei could tell you the class. He could estimate the speed within 2 knots. He could track a contact through thermal layers and across convergence zones where other operators lost it. His commanding officer, Captain Second Rank Viktor Leonov, began requesting Sergei specifically for sensitive patrols. By 1978, Sergei had been transferred to a newer boat, a Project 671 RTM, or Victor III class. This was a significant improvement over the earlier Victors. The Victor III featured a distinctive large pod mounted on the upper vertical stabilizer, which Western intelligence spent years trying to identify. It was, in fact, a towed sonar array housing, a system that allowed the submarine to deploy a long cable studded with hydrophones behind it, dramatically increasing its passive listening capability. But what really made the difference wasn't the equipment. It was what the Soviets had done with their signal processing. This is where the story takes a turn that most Western historians have only recently begun to appreciate. Throughout the 1970s, the Soviet Union had been quietly investing in digital signal processing technology for underwater acoustics. The effort was centered at the Morphus Pribor Research Institute in Leningrad, and the Krylov Shipbuilding Research Institute. The work was painstaking, methodical, and almost entirely invisible to Western intelligence. The challenge they were trying to solve was fundamental. The ocean is a noisy place. At any given moment, a hydrophone picks up thousands of individual sounds. Waves, marine life, distant shipping traffic, geological activity, the submarine's own machinery. Buried somewhere in that wall of noise might be the faint acoustic signature of an enemy submarine. Finding it was like trying to hear a whisper in a stadium during a football game. The American approach relied on massive computational power. The SOSUS network, a vast chain of underwater hydrophone arrays anchored to the ocean floor across the Atlantic and Pacific, fed their data to processing centers where enormous computers ran sophisticated algorithms to filter, classify, and track contacts. The system was extraordinarily effective. At its peak, SOSUS could detect Soviet submarines transiting through the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap with remarkable reliability. The Soviets didn't have that kind of infrastructure. What they had was talented mathematicians and a different philosophy. Rather than building a system that relied on brute computational force, Soviet researchers developed algorithms that were optimized for efficiency, designed to extract maximum information from limited processing power. They focused on narrow band analysis, looking for specific frequency lines in the acoustic spectrum that were characteristic of particular submarine types. They developed techniques for correlating multiple sensor inputs to improve detection probability, and they trained their sonar operators, men like Sergey, to work in partnership with the machines, using human auditory intuition to guide and validate the automated processing. But what Sergey didn't know, what none of the sonar operators knew at the time, was that in 1983, the Morphus Pribor Institute achieved a breakthrough that would change everything. A team led by a physicist named Arkady Petrov, a name that appears in almost no Western accounts of Cold War submarine technology, developed a new processing algorithm that could isolate extremely faint narrowband signals from background noise. The mathematics behind it were elegant, drawing on techniques from radio astronomy that had been adapted for underwater acoustics. The system was designated SCAT-3, and it was installed on a limited number of Northern Fleet submarines beginning in early 1984. The Victor III that Sergey Volkov was assigned to in September 1984 was one of the first boats to receive it. The day the SCAT-3 system was installed, Sergey sat in the sonar compartment and ran a calibration test. He played back a recording of known acoustic signatures at progressively lower signal-to-noise ratios. The old system lost the signal at minus 18 decibels below ambient noise. The SCAT-3 held it down to minus 32. Sergey stared at the display for a long time. Then he went to find Captain Leonov. "Captain," he said, "with this system, I can hear things we've never heard before." Leonov looked at him with the measured skepticism of a man who had spent 20 years in the submarine service. "What kinds of things?" "Quiet things, Captain. Very quiet things." And that was the beginning. In November 1984, Sergey's submarine, K-324, deployed on a routine Northern Fleet patrol into the Norwegian Sea. The Norwegian Sea was one of the most strategically important bodies of water on Earth during the Cold War. It was the corridor through which Soviet submarines had to pass to reach the open Atlantic. And it was the patrol area where American and British ballistic missile submarines lurked, ready to launch their missiles over the North Pole toward Soviet targets. Finding those submarines was the holy grail of Soviet naval intelligence. If the Soviet Union could reliably track Western ballistic missile submarines, the entire logic of nuclear deterrence would be undermined. The second strike guarantee would evaporate. The balance of terror would shift. For decades, they had tried and failed. American submarines were simply too quiet. Soviet boats could detect surface ships, other Soviet submarines, older American attack submarines, but the newest American boats, and especially the Ohio-class boomers, were ghosts, until November 23rd, 1984. The first time Sergey Volkov heard something that shouldn't have been there. They were cruising at a depth of 200 meters, making 4 knots, trailing the towed sonar array. Sergey was on watch, monitoring the SCAT-3 display, when he noticed a faint line on the frequency waterfall. So faint that on the old system it would have been invisible. It was a narrow band contact at approximately 60 hertz, consistent with the frequency produced by a large, low-speed turbine generator, but it was impossibly quiet. Sergey adjusted the system parameters, narrowed the bandwidth, increased the integration time. The line strengthened slightly. It was there, steady, moving slowly on a bearing of roughly 350, almost due north. He called the watch officer. Lieutenant Yuri Demidov came over and looked at the display. He frowned. "That could be biologics," Demidov said. "Whale song harmonic." "No," Sergey said firmly. "The line is too stable. Biologics drift in frequency. This is mechanical. And look at the bearing rate. It's consistent with a vessel making between 5 and 8 knots on a steady course." "Oh," Demidov studied the display for another minute. "I don't see enough to classify it." "Give me time," Sergey said. "Let me track it." Demidov hesitated. Reporting an unconfirmed contact would mean alerting the captain, changing course, possibly compromising their own patrol. If it turned out to be nothing, a false alarm, there would be consequences. Soviet Navy discipline was not forgiving of mistakes, but something in Sergey's voice convinced him. Demidov had served with Volkov for 2 years. He had never seen the man wrong about a sonar contact. "You have 30 minutes, Demidov said. Sergey worked in focused silence. He adjusted filters, cross-referenced the contact bearing with the towed array and the hull-mounted sonar, compensated for their own boat's noise. 22 minutes later, he had enough. "It's a submarine," he said. "Single shaft, 7-bladed propeller. Low cavitation, very quiet reactor plant. I can barely detect the primary coolant flow. She's big, Lieutenant. This is not an attack submarine." Demidov's eyes widened. In the Soviet sonar classification manual, those characteristics matched only one type of vessel. "You think that's a boomer?" "I know it is," Sergey said. "And based on the frequency profile of the turbine generator and the propeller blade rate, I think it's an Ohio." That word changed everything. Demidov went to get Captain Leonov. The captain was in his stateroom, catching a rare hour of sleep. He was on his feet in seconds. Leonov spent 10 minutes in the sonar compartment, listening to Sergey's analysis, watching the display. Then he made a decision that would have implications reaching far beyond that submarine, that ocean, that year. "We follow her," he said. "And Volkov, you record everything." What followed was 11 hours of the most intense submarine tracking in Soviet naval history. K-324 shadowed the American submarine at a range of approximately 12 to 15 nautical miles, staying just within the detection envelope of the SCAT-3 system. Sergey never left his station. He tracked the Ohio class through 2 course changes, a depth adjustment, and a brief period of increased speed that nearly caused him to lose contact. At one point, about 6 hours into the tracking, the American submarine executed what submariners call a clearing turn, a deliberate change of course designed to allow the submarine's sonar to check the area behind it for any trailing vessel. This was standard procedure for ballistic missile submarines on patrol. The Ohio class turned sharply to port, reversed its track for several miles, then resumed its original course. K-324's captain ordered an immediate depth change and speed reduction to minimize their own acoustic signature during the clearing turn. Sergey held his breath, literally, as the American submarine's sonar swept the waters around them. The Victor III was not a quiet submarine by American standards. If the Ohio's sonar operators were alert, they might detect K-324 during the maneuver. They didn't. The American submarine resumed its patrol course, apparently satisfied that it was alone. "She doesn't know we're here," Sergey whispered, and he felt something he had never felt before in his naval career, a mixture of exhilaration and something close to dread, because he understood, better than perhaps anyone else in that submarine, exactly what this meant. If a Soviet submarine could track an Ohio class, the entire strategic calculus of the Cold War had shifted. The tape reel turned slowly in its housing, recording every second of acoustic data, frequency analysis, bearing measurements, signal strength variations, ambient noise profiles. It was all captured in the magnetic patterns on that narrow strip of oxide-coated tape. After 11 hours, Captain Leonov ordered K-324 to break off contact. They had accomplished something that the Soviet Navy had been trying to do for over a decade. And they had the proof. When K-324 returned to Gadzhievo in December 1984, Leonov immediately filed his patrol report through classified channels. The report went up the chain of command, from the submarine squadron commander to the Northern Fleet headquarters at Severomorsk, then to the main naval staff in Moscow. Attached to the report was a copy of Sergey Volkov's acoustic recording, along with his detailed analysis of the contact. The reaction was extraordinary, even by Soviet military standards. Within 2 weeks, a team of analysts from the Morphis Pribor Institute arrived at Gadzhievo to debrief Sergey personally. They spent 3 days going over the recording, second by second. Arkady Petrov himself, the physicist who had developed the SCAT-3 algorithm, was among them. Petrov was a thin, intense man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his entire career waiting for his work to be validated. He listened to the recording in silence, made calculations in a small notebook, then looked at Sergey with an expression that was almost reverent. "You tracked it for 11 hours, Petrov said. "Yes." "At what maximum range?" 15 nautical miles, approximately. "The signal was marginal beyond that," Petrov nodded slowly. "The Americans believe this is impossible. Their assessments, we've seen them through other channels, their assessments say that Soviet sonar cannot detect an Ohio class at any range. They consider their submarine invisible." Sergey said nothing. He had learned long ago that in the Soviet military, it was better to let senior people draw their own conclusions. Petrov drew his. "This recording is going to Moscow. Volkov, you may have just changed the trajectory of this entire confrontation." But what Petrov didn't tell Sergey, what Sergey wouldn't learn until much later, was that the recording also represented a profound danger. Because if the Americans ever discovered that their Ohio-class submarines could be tracked, they would do everything in their power to find out how, and to neutralize the advantage. And there were people within the Soviet system who were already working to make sure the Americans found out, not through incompetence, through betrayal. The year 1985 would later become known in intelligence circles as the Year of the Spy. It was a year in which the invisible war between the KGB and the CIA erupted into a series of devastating espionage cases. In May, John Walker, a retired U.S. Navy warrant officer who had been passing classified information to the Soviets for 17 years, was arrested by the FBI. Walker's espionage had given the Soviets access to American naval communications encryption keys, allowing them to read classified message traffic for over a decade, but the spy traffic ran in both directions. In June 1985, Aldrich Ames, a senior CIA officer, began providing the KGB with the identities of Soviet citizens who were secretly working for American intelligence. Ames's betrayal would eventually lead to the execution of at least 10 Soviet agents. And in the same year, a KGB officer named Vitaly Yurchenko defected to the CIA, providing information about Soviet intelligence operations before dramatically redefecting back to the Soviet Union 3 months later, a case so bizarre that intelligence professionals still argue about what actually happened. This was the environment in which Sergey Volkov's recording entered the labyrinth of Soviet military intelligence. And the labyrinth had leaks. In February 1985, K-324 deployed again. This time, the mission was different. Instead of a routine patrol, they had been given a specific tasking by the main naval staff: return to the Norwegian Sea and attempt to replicate the Ohio-class detection. Fleet intelligence wanted to confirm that the November contact was not a fluke. They needed to prove that the SCAT-3 system could reliably detect American ballistic missile submarines. The patrol was designated Operation Okean 85. Though it bore no relation to the larger naval exercises that sometimes carried that name. Only the submarine's senior officers and the sonar team knew the true purpose of the mission. For 2 weeks, K-324 prowled the Norwegian Sea's deep basins. The conditions were challenging. Late winter in the Norwegian Sea meant fierce surface storms that generated significant underwater noise, and the thermal structure of the water created complex acoustic propagation patterns that shifted unpredictably. Sergey spent 12 to 14 hours a day at his station, methodically scanning the frequency spectrum, adjusting for environmental conditions, waiting. On March 3rd, 1985, he found another one. This time, the detection came faster. Sergey knew what to look for now: the specific frequency lines, the characteristic pattern of the Ohio-class machinery noise. The contact was bearing 175, range approximately 11 nautical miles, depth estimated at 300 meters. It was following a patrol pattern: long, slow legs with periodic course changes, the signature behavior of a ballistic missile submarine on deterrent patrol. K-324 tracked this second Ohio class for 7 hours before the American submarine moved out of detection range. Once again, Sergey recorded everything. When the submarine returned to base, the recording was analyzed and confirmed. 2 separate detections of Ohio-class submarines. The SCAT-3 system worked. The impossible was now routine. The news reached the highest levels of the Soviet military command. Admiral Vladimir Chernovin, the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy, reportedly described the development as the most significant intelligence achievement of the Northern Fleet in 15 years. Plans were immediately drawn up to install SCAT-3 systems on additional submarines and to develop improved versions with greater detection range. But even as the Soviet Navy celebrated its breakthrough, forces were already in motion that would bring the entire secret crashing down. The first crack appeared in August 1985. A GRU officer, military intelligence, not KGB, approached the CIA and offered information about Soviet naval technology. Disillusioned with the system and motivated by a mix of ideology, financial incentive, and personal frustration, he revealed that the Soviet Navy had successfully tracked American ballistic missile submarines in the Norwegian Sea. He lacked technical details, but provided operational ones: approximate dates, the general area, the submarine type involved. This information reached the Office of Naval Intelligence in September 1985. The reaction was, at first, dismissive. The prevailing belief was so firmly entrenched, Soviet sonar simply could not detect Ohio-class submarines, that the intelligence was classified as unconfirmed, probably disinformation. The thinking was that the Soviets had planted the story to create doubt and anxiety within the American military establishment, but a small number of analysts weren't so sure. One of them was a civilian acoustics specialist named Dr. Margaret Chen, who worked at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. Chen had been studying Soviet acoustic research for years, and she had noticed something that most of her colleagues had missed: a series of technical papers published in obscure Soviet scientific journals in the late 1970s and early 1980s that described theoretical advances in narrowband signal processing. The papers were written in dense mathematical language, and most American analysts had dismissed them as theoretical exercises with no practical application. Chen disagreed. She had worked through the mathematics herself and realized that the techniques described could, in theory, achieve detection thresholds significantly lower than anything the Western intelligence community had assumed the Soviets capable of. The math works, she told her supervisor in a memo dated October 1985. If they've implemented even a fraction of what these papers describe, our assumptions about Ohio-class undetectability may need to be revised. Her memo was noted, filed, and largely ignored. It would take something much more dramatic to break through the institutional certainty of the American defense establishment. That something was Sergey Volkov. The events that led to Volkov's defection began not with a dramatic moment of decision, but with a slow accumulation of disillusionment, a process that took nearly 2 years and that consumed him like rust consuming iron, so gradually that he didn't recognize what was happening until it was already too late to stop. It started with the medals. After the successful Ohio-class trackings, Captain Leonoff was promoted and decorated. The fleet commander received a commendation. The Morphus Prebor team received state awards. Sergey Volkov, the man who had actually sat at the sonar console and detected the undetectable, received nothing. Not a promotion, not a medal, not even a mention in the classified after-action report. The credit flowed upward, as it always did in the Soviet system, pooling at the level of admirals and institute directors while the men who did the actual work remained invisible. Sergey had expected this. It was how the system worked. He had watched his father give 26 years to the shipyard and receive nothing but scarred hands and damaged lungs. The Soviet Union rewarded loyalty with neglect and excellence with anonymity. This was not news. This was the way of things. What he hadn't expected was what happened next. In January 1986, Sergey's father, Mikhail, was diagnosed with lung cancer. The decades of welding in the poorly ventilated holds of submarines at Sevmash had filled his lungs with metal particles and toxic fumes. The shipyard's medical facility diagnosed the cancer at stage 3 and offered palliative care, pain management essentially, while waiting for the inevitable. There was a hospital in Moscow that had better equipment, newer treatments, a chance. But Mikhail Volkov was a shipyard welder, not a party official. The Moscow hospital was for people who mattered. Sergey requested a transfer to a shore posting in Severodvinsk to be near his father. The request was denied. He was told that his sonar skills were too valuable and that the fleet couldn't spare him. When he pressed the matter through his commanding officer, he was told, unofficially, that if he continued to complain, he would be transferred, not to Severodvinsk, but to a diesel submarine operating out of Polyarny, the worst posting in the Northern Fleet. His father died on February 18th, 1986. Sergey was at sea. He learned about it 3 days later when K-324 surfaced to receive communications. The message was 9 words long. Father deceased 18th of February, burial 20th of February. Family informed, 9 words for 26 years of service. Something changed in Sergey Volkov that day. It wasn't anger, it was something colder. The man who walked off K-324 at Gajievo in early March was not the same man who had boarded it. He was quieter, more withdrawn. But Sergey wasn't just grieving. He was thinking about the system that had used his skills and discarded his humanity, about the admirals who wore medals earned by his ears, about a father who had given his lungs to the shipyard and received nothing, not even decent medical care, in return, about a country that could build submarines capable of destroying the world but couldn't build a hospital capable of saving one old welder. And he was thinking about the tape. The original recordings from the Ohio-class trackings were stored in the fleet's classified archives at Severomorsk, but Sergey had made his own copies. Not officially, and not with authorization, but as a personal professional record. Sonar operators sometimes kept such records for training purposes, and while it was technically a violation of security protocols, it was common enough that no one had ever questioned it. Sergey had 2 tape reels in his personal locker aboard K-324. They contained the complete acoustic recordings from both Ohio-class detections. They were, in intelligence terms, priceless. The decision crystallized during a port call in Murmansk in early March. Sergey was walking through the city, gray, cold, the wind carrying the smell of diesel fuel from the harbor, when he passed a building housing the International Seamen's Union. A poster advertised a cultural exchange with Scandinavian countries. It showed Stockholm in summer, sunlight on water, clean streets, people walking freely. Sergey stopped. He looked at the poster for a long time. Then he walked into the building. The mechanics of Soviet defections during the Cold War were complicated and dangerous. The Soviet military maintained extensive surveillance of its personnel, particularly those with access to classified information. Travel abroad was heavily restricted. Communications were monitored. The KGB's 3rd Directorate, responsible for military counterintelligence, maintained informants on every major naval vessel and at every shore installation. Sergey was intelligent enough to know that a direct approach to a Western embassy would be suicidal. The KGB watched the embassies constantly. Any Soviet military personnel seen near a Western diplomatic facility would be arrested within hours. Instead, he used the Cultural Exchange Program. It was a legitimate program designed to promote goodwill between Soviet and Scandinavian maritime workers. Participants were carefully vetted, but Sergey's record was clean. No political complaints, no disciplinary issues, no contact with foreigners. His application was approved for a group visit to Stockholm scheduled for March 8th through 12th, 1986. The group was accompanied by a KGB minder, a man named Oleg, who posed as a trade union official. Sergey studied him carefully. The man was competent but predictable. Head counts at set times, no continuous surveillance, and a fondness for Swedish beer that dulled his attention by evening. On the evening of March 10th, during a free period, Sergey slipped away. He went to a payphone and dialed a number obtained through a chain of contacts so indirect he couldn't fully reconstruct it. A Finnish merchant sailor, a Swedish journalist. A number passed through 3 intermediaries over 4 months. The phone rang 4 times. A woman answered in Swedish. Sergey spoke in halting English. He had studied it at the naval school, spending his scarce free hours with a battered English-Russian dictionary. and said a phrase that had been given to him. "I have information about underwater acoustics that your friends would find interesting." There was a pause, 3 seconds of silence that felt like 3 hours. Then the woman said, also in English, "Where are you now?" 40 minutes later, a car picked Sergey up from a side street in Sudermalm. He was driven to an apartment where 2 men were waiting. They were American. They did not give their names. One was tall, with gray hair. The other was younger, heavy-set, with military bearing. Both spoke Russian fluently, but with classroom accents. What followed was 4 hours of preliminary debriefing. Sergey described who he was, his position, his experience. He described the SCAT-3 system in general terms. And then he told them about the Ohio-class detections. The 2 Americans exchanged a look that Sergey would later describe as the expression of men who have just been told that their house is on fire and they are standing in the living room. "Can you prove this?" one of them asked. Sergey reached into the lining of his coat and produced a small magnetic tape reel. He had carried it out of the Soviet Union by cutting a slit in the coat's quilted insulation and sliding the reel between layers of fabric. He had worn the coat through customs at Pulkovo Airport in Leningrad, through the transit lounge at Helsinki, through the arrival formalities in Stockholm. At any point, a search would have found it. A search would have ended his life. Not figuratively, but literally. Espionage in the Soviet military was punishable by death. He had not been searched. "Play it," he said. They didn't have the equipment to play it that night, but they knew what they had. The tall man made a phone call from another room. 20 minutes later, a third American arrived. A woman, brisk and professional, who took the tape reel with gloved hands and placed it in a padded case. Within hours, Sergey Volkov was on a military flight from Stockholm to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and from there to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. The tape traveled in a separate aircraft, in a locked container, accompanied by 2 armed escorts. It was treated with the same security protocols used for nuclear weapons components. The KGB minder didn't notice Sergey's absence until the following morning. By then, Sergey was 6,000 miles away, sitting in a safe house in suburban Virginia, drinking American coffee and staring at a world he had never imagined he would inhabit. And 4 days later, on the morning of March 14th, 1986, the tape was played for Admiral Richard Calloway and his team in a Pentagon briefing room. The silence after the tape ended lasted much longer than 9 seconds. It lasted, in a metaphorical sense, for months. Admiral Calloway ordered an immediate investigation. The tape was sent to the Naval Research Laboratory for analysis. Dr. Margaret Chen, the same analyst who had warned about Soviet acoustic advances 6 months earlier, was assigned to lead the technical assessment. Chen's team spent 3 weeks analyzing the recording. They compared it against known acoustic signatures of every Ohio-class submarine in the fleet, examined the frequency components and environmental data, and consulted with submarine officers and acoustics experts from MIT and Woods Hole. Their conclusion, delivered in a classified report dated April 4th, 1986, was unambiguous. The recording was genuine. It contained the acoustic signature of an Ohio-class submarine, captured at a range and signal-to-noise ratio that demonstrated a Soviet detection capability far exceeding anything previously assumed by American intelligence. The specific submarine could not be positively identified. The differences between individual Ohio-class boats were too subtle for the recording quality, but the class identification was certain. Chen added a personal note to the report that would be quoted years later in classified briefings and declassified histories. This represents a fundamental shift in the underwater acoustic balance. If this capability is deployed fleet-wide, the survivability of our SSBN force during a crisis cannot be guaranteed. The assumption of Ohio-class undetectability, upon which our entire second strike posture depends, must be reconsidered immediately. The paragraph triggered a cascade of responses that would reshape American submarine technology for the next decade and cost taxpayers billions of dollars. The first response was operational. Within 48 hours of Chen's report, patrol areas and movement patterns of Ohio-class submarines were changed. New evasion protocols were developed and transmitted to every boomer at sea via extremely low-frequency radio, the only communication method that could reach a submarine at patrol depth. Patrol depths were adjusted, speed profiles were modified. The submarines were ordered to adopt more random movement patterns and to increase the frequency of their clearing turns. The second response was technical. A crash program was launched to further reduce the acoustic signature of Ohio-class submarines. This led to new propeller designs, improved machinery isolation systems, and refinements to the anechoic hull coating. The most critical improvement was a redesigned reduction gear that eliminated a specific frequency component Sergey had identified as a key detection signature. The total cost of the modifications exceeded $2 billion. The third response was intelligence. A massive effort was undertaken to determine the full extent of Soviet acoustic capabilities. Every available intelligence source was tasked. Satellite imagery of Soviet submarine yards and research facilities, signals intelligence intercepts of Soviet naval communications, human intelligence assets within the Soviet military establishment. The goal was to understand not just the SCAT-3 system, but the entire Soviet underwater acoustic research program, its capabilities, its limitations, and its future trajectory. And the fourth response was the one that affected Sergey Volkov most directly. He was debriefed for 96 consecutive days by a joint CIA-Navy team at a location he was never told the name of. A sprawling estate in the Virginia countryside with manicured lawns, armed guards in plain clothes, and the atmosphere of a very expensive prison. The debriefing was exhaustive. Sergey described the SCAT-3 system in extraordinary detail, its processing algorithms, its hardware components, its operational procedures. He sketched circuit diagrams from memory. He described the tactical doctrine for submarine tracking, the training of sonar operators, the maintenance procedures and failure modes. He gave them everything, and in the quiet hours between sessions, sitting alone, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American night, he thought about what he had done. He hadn't defected for ideology. He didn't hate the Soviet Union. He didn't love the United States. He had left because the system had taken his father and hadn't allowed him to say goodbye. Because medals went to men in offices, while men in sonar compartments went unrecognized. Because a country that could track the world's most advanced submarine couldn't provide cancer treatment for a shipyard welder. In exchange for his cooperation, Sergey asked for three things: a new identity, a quiet life somewhere warm, and assurance that his sister Irina would not be harmed. The CIA could guarantee the first two. The third was beyond their power. Sergey Volkov was given a new name, Stephen Vance, and resettled in a small town on the coast of Virginia. He was given a modest stipend, a furnished apartment with a view of the Chesapeake Bay, and a job teaching mathematics at the community college. His students knew him as a quiet, precise man with a slight accent he never explained. He lived alone. He cooked simple meals. He read American novels and slowly improved his English until the accent softened but never disappeared. In the evenings, he walked on the beach and listened to the waves, a sound that was never just waves to him. It was layers, frequencies, patterns. He never married. He never made close friends. He never heard from his sister again. In the years that followed, the full implications rippled through the American defense establishment. The Trident submarine force was modified, upgraded, and eventually supplemented by newer designs. The next generation, the Columbia class, was designed from the keel up with the assumption that adversary sonar would continue to advance. The old assumption of permanent undetectability was gone, but the larger lesson was not about technology. It was about assumptions. The American intelligence community had been so confident in the Ohio class's invisibility that it had stopped asking whether the assumption was valid. The data that might have challenged it, Soviet scientific papers, reports from analysts like Chen, was available but filtered through institutional certainty. The system confirmed what everyone already believed and was incapable of processing contradictions. Intelligence professionals call this mirror imaging, the tendency to assume that an adversary is limited in the same ways you are. American analysts knew exactly how far behind Soviet technology lagged. What they failed to imagine was that the Soviets might close the gap not by catching up on the same path, but by finding a different path entirely, one that relied on mathematical elegance rather than computational brute force, on a single exceptional operator, rather than a network of sensors. It took a single man carrying a single tape reel, walking out of one world and into another to shatter the assumption. Admiral Richard Callaway retired in 1989. In his farewell address at the Pentagon, he said something that people who were present still remember. "We spent 40 years building the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in human history, and the most important piece of intelligence I ever received came from a man who walked in off the street with a tape recorder and a broken heart. Remember that. The next time every model confirms what you already believe, remember that man, because the thing that breaks your certainty won't come from inside the system. It never does." The Cold War ended 2 years later. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union dissolved, the submarines that had stalked each other beneath the Arctic ice were retired or left to rust. The sonar systems, the tracking algorithms, the elaborate cat-and-mouse games, all of it became history. But the tape still exists. It sits in a climate-controlled vault at the Naval Research Laboratory, still classified. Not because the technology is still relevant. Submarine acoustics have advanced beyond recognition since the 1980s, but because the tape represents something the defense establishment prefers not to advertise. A moment when the invincible was found, a moment when the undetectable was detected. The tape is labeled with a simple alphanumeric code, no mention of Sergey Volkov's name. Someday, the magnetic patterns will blur until the signal is indistinguishable from noise, and the sound of an Ohio-class submarine recorded on a November night in 1984 will be gone, but the story will remain. And somewhere on the coast of Virginia, if he is still alive, an old man who was once the finest sonar operator in the Soviet Navy walks on the beach in the evening. The sun sets over the Chesapeake, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. He listens. He always listens. He hears the waves, not as a single sound, but as 1,000 individual sounds. He hears the wind through the beach grass, the distant hum of a boat engine 3 miles offshore, the barely perceptible vibration of traffic on the highway. And beneath it all, if he listens very carefully, he can still hear it, that low, rhythmic hum, the ghost frequency, the sound of the machine that was supposed to be invisible. He heard it first on a November night in 1984, alone in a sonar compartment aboard a Soviet submarine, wearing headphones that cost less than an admiral's shoes. He heard it, and he recorded it, and he carried it across the world in the lining of his coat. And when he played it for the men who had built the machine and believed it was perfect, they went pale. Because the truth doesn't care about rank, or budgets, or institutional certainty, or the assumptions of superpowers. It simply is. And when it arrives, in a windowless briefing room, 3 floors below the Pentagon concourse, carried by a defector with trembling hands and a magnetic tape reel, it changes everything. That was the story of the Soviet sailor who played one tape for the Pentagon, and the Admiral who went pale. If it made you think about certainty, about assumptions, about the invisible wars fought beneath the surface of the things we take for granted, then I've done my job. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one.